There's a specific kind of silence that only fills a house when it hasn't heard laughter in a while. Mine stretched wall to wall, clean, polite, but hollow. Ever since Jim passed 2 years ago, the nights had become ceremonies of quiet. I kept the television on for background noise and left one kitchen light on to pretend someone might walk in, but no one did. That night, the clock glowed 12:17 a.m. in pale blue digits. I sat in my robe, a cup of chamomile untouched, scrolling through old vacation photos on my iPad. A younger version of myself smiled in every frame, wading through tide pools, laughing in the passenger seat, reading on a sun-drenched balcony. That woman felt far away. She didn't ask, "Is this all that's left?" On a whim I barely understood, I opened the dating app my niece had installed months ago. "Just to browse," she said, "not to commit." The app had been gathering digital dust ever since. I tapped it open with the same caution one might give to a sealed envelope from an old friend. The photos were endless. Smiling men beside dogs, holding fishing rods, or standing next to sedans with suspiciously cropped license plates. I almost closed the app again. Almost. Then I saw him. Stephen Hayes. His profile didn't scream for attention. No shirtless selfies or boastful bios. Just a simple photo of a man standing by the sea, wearing a navy sweater and a quiet smile. He wrote he was a widower, 63, retired marine engineer, living in Portland. He loved poetry, baked sourdough bread, and missed having someone to say goodnight to. That last line did something to me. I hesitated, then pressed the heart icon. I expected nothing. That's what grief trained you for, silence after effort. But less than a minute later, a message arrived. "Hello, Helen. I hope you're not still awake for the same reason I am. Missing someone." There it was, not a pickup line, a shared ache. It felt like someone had cracked a window in a room sealed too long. We began to write. I told him about Jim, about how we used to read on Sunday afternoons, about his laugh, about the way he insisted on washing dishes even when his hands ached from chemo. I hadn't typed those memories before. Seeing them in black and white pixels made them tremble more than I expected. Stephen responded not with sympathy, but with recognition. He wrote about his late wife, Margaret, who once painted watercolor stills of Oregon cliffs, who used to hum when she cooked. He said loneliness wasn't about absence, but about presence without reflection, being in a room with only your own echo. That first night, we exchanged 12 messages. Nothing inappropriate, nothing fast, just two people building a bridge out of shared shadows. I went to bed at 2:03 a.m. For the first time in months, I didn't check if the doors were locked twice. For the first time since Jim's passing, I felt someone had seen me, really seen me, not as a widow, not as an age, but as a woman still alive. I didn't know it then, but that tiny red heart I'd tapped in digital curiosity would mark the beginning of a journey filled with deception, danger, and a justice I'd never expected to deliver. But that night, it was just a message at midnight, and it felt like hope. They say grief comes in waves, but for me, it came like fog, slow, thick, and always there, even in sunshine. That's what the early days with Stephen felt like. A bit of light through my own haze. After our first late-night exchange, our messages quickly became a rhythm. Not intrusive, not pushy, just comforting. Every morning, I'd wake up to his messages. His greetings were gentle. "Good morning, Helen. I hope the sun touches your porch today." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he seemed to see me in them. He asked about my garden, about what book I was reading, about the way Oregon's skies changed in spring. And I found myself telling him things I hadn't spoken aloud since Jim died. We talked about music, about memories, about how the silence in a house can sometimes feel louder than any storm. He said he missed someone to share a meal with. I said I missed the sound of another mug being set down beside mine. For 30 days straight, we wrote each other every day. It became a ritual. I'd sit by the window with my tea and reread his messages like scripture. He quoted poetry, Pablo Neruda, mostly, and sent blurry sunset photos from the deck of some ship where he said he was doing contract work. Something about being near the ocean made his loneliness bearable, he wrote. And somehow, reading his words made mine easier too. One evening, I sent him a photo of the tomatoes I'd finally gotten to grow in my backyard. He responded with a picture of a bread loaf he said he'd baked himself, followed by a detailed description of the sourdough starter he babied like a child. I laughed aloud for the first time in weeks. That alone felt like a small miracle. But small details started to flicker. His video never worked. He said, "The signal out here is terrible. Middle of the ocean." I accepted that at first. Of course a marine contractor would have spotty internet. But then, once, just once, I asked to call. Not video, just voice. He said he couldn't talk that night, then the next night, and the next. He always had the perfect excuse, and I always let it pass, because part of me didn't want to poke holes in something that finally felt full. Still, I noticed. I noticed how his story sometimes shifted in tone. He once mentioned he didn't like dogs, then later told a story about walking one on the beach. He said he had a daughter living in Maine, but when I asked about her, he gave me a different name than the first time. I kept notes, not out of distrust, but because I had learned from widowhood that memory is slippery. That's what I told myself, anyway. One afternoon, he told me I made his days brighter, that my messages had become his anchor. He called me his peace. The word struck something in me. After so long being invisible, it felt beautiful to be seen again. And yet, something quietly trembled under that beauty. Because on day 30, as I scrolled through our long chain of correspondence, I realized something chilling. For all the words he had written, all the affection he had expressed, I still didn't know what his voice actually sounded like. 30 days, hundreds of messages, and not a single second of real sound. That night, I stared at my reflection in the dark window. Behind me, my quiet house. Before me, a man I'd never met, never heard, never touched, yet whose words had become part of my breath. I went to sleep with his last message still unread. For the first time in weeks, I hesitated. My heart said romance, but my instincts, long neglected, had finally started whispering, "Something isn't right." It was a Tuesday when the shift happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just quiet. I was reorganizing my spice drawer when Stephen's latest message came in. "I wish I could smell your kitchen. I bet it smells like cinnamon and something sweet." At first, I smiled. Then I paused, because I hadn't told him anything about baking. Not once. My fingers hovered over the phone. I scrolled back through our past conversations. Nothing. I'd talked about gardening, about tea, about Jim's habit of overcooking pasta, but I had never said a word about cinnamon. It was a small thing, but something about it unsettled me. I tried to brush it off, but that little ripple had already disturbed the surface. So I sat down, opened his profile picture, and looked at it with new eyes. It was a simple portrait. A man in a navy sweater, standing near water, slightly turned, smiling faintly, warm, trustworthy, too perfect. A few minutes later, I opened my laptop and typed something I'd never searched before. How to reverse image search. The tutorial was quick. I downloaded a browser extension, uploaded Stephen's picture, and waited. The results hit me like a slap. Not one match, not two, but four. 4 profiles with 4 different names. Same face, different lives. Michael T. in Florida, George A. in Alberta, Martin C. in Cape Town, and my Stephen Hayes, the widowed marine engineer from Portland. The fog that had gently cushioned the last 30 days evaporated instantly. In its place, clarity, so sharp it burned. I sat there frozen, my hands trembling slightly, the edges of my laptop warm against my palms. I clicked on each version of his face. They were all almost identical, just slightly different smiles, slightly different bios, but every one of them spoke about being a widower, a man who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and was now looking for quiet companionship. The script was almost word for word what I had read, what I had believed, what I had cherished. A hollow opened inside me. Grief, yes, but not the kind I had felt when Jim passed. This was a grief of betrayal, a grief of self-doubt. How could I have let this happen? How could I have missed the signs? But in the same breath, something else rose behind it. Something older, something stronger. I'd been married for 37 years to a man who taught me how to listen to silence, how to notice when something wasn't said, not just what was. And that part of me, the part Jim helped shape, began to rise from the ashes. This wasn't just a scam. It was a pattern, a system. And if he, or they, had done it to me, then they'd done it to others. And maybe not everyone was as lucky to be asking questions before it was too late. That night, I printed every message, every photo, every little detail I had dismissed as romantic. I no longer wanted love. I wanted the truth. The morning after I uncovered his photo across 4 identities, I didn't write back. Not immediately. Instead, I stared at the message he'd sent just before I made the discovery. It was a long one, longer than usual, full of apology and concern, and a story that sounded urgent, yet too well rehearsed. He said he needed help. Apparently, a shipment of medical supplies he had personally financed for a children's orphanage in Liberia had been delayed at the port. Customs officials were demanding extra documentation fees, and he had already drained his personal account, covering the earlier costs. It wasn't just a story, it was a test. He said he was desperate, ashamed to even ask, but trusted me more than anyone. "If you can help," he wrote, "I'll repay you as soon as I'm back. The children, they're counting on this." And there it was, the hook. Not an ask for love, an ask for money, cloaked in emotional blackmail, dressed up in charity. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. Just 2 days earlier, I might have responded with panic and a wired transfer. I might have felt honored to be trusted with such a noble mission. But now I knew this wasn't a romance. It was a con wrapped in warm words and imaginary orphans. Still, I didn't reply with anger. I didn't accuse him. Instead, I copied the message. I saved it. I documented every sentence. I began building a folder, one I'd later name Evidence Stephen, on my desktop. It was then I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. He wasn't improvising. He was reading from a script. And if he was using it on me, then others were likely hearing the same tale, the same orphanage, the same customs fees, the same guilt trap. I printed the message, highlighted key words: urgent, hope, trust, words engineered to bypass reason and aim straight at the heart. And here's what stunned me most. Part of me still wanted to believe it, that maybe he really did care, that perhaps his story had some thread of truth, that he wasn't completely a lie. Because the cruelest part of this kind of manipulation isn't the money. It's how it hijacks your hope. It makes you complicit in your own deception. And admitting that hurts. So I did something I hadn't done since Jim died. I called my niece. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just listened, quietly, carefully. Then she asked one question: "Do you want to get justice, or do you want to let it go?" I told her the truth. I didn't want revenge. I wanted prevention. Because somewhere, another woman was reading the same message. Somewhere, another person was about to send their rent money to a man who claimed to be feeding orphans. And they wouldn't have a niece who could help them trace crypto wallets or flag email IPs. They'd just send the money and cry later. But I still had time. So I opened a new file. I titled it simply Plan. The next morning, I walked into my library like I had for the past 16 years. The smell of old pages and lemon polish greeted me like a familiar friend, constant, steady, predictable. That day, I needed predictable. I had spent the night tossing and turning, not because of grief, but because of something colder: calculation. I kept asking myself, how do I catch someone who has made a life out of staying invisible? But answers don't always come when you look for them. Sometimes they find you when you're shelving romance novels in aisle C. 2 teenage girls were sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering over a laptop. I might have told them to quiet down, but something in their tone caught me. They weren't gossiping, they were focused. One of them said, "Girl, just reverse image that profile. Takes 2 seconds." The other laughed and said, "Yeah, my mom almost got catfished last month. These guys use AI now." My breath caught. I stepped away, pretending to dust a shelf, and let their words settle in my ears. Reverse image, AI-generated profiles, scams as a service. This wasn't amateur hour anymore. This was industry. Later, during lunch, I sat at the break room computer and typed quietly, "How to trace a scammer's email." The search results overwhelmed me. DNS lookups, email headers, IP tracing. I didn't understand most of it, but I knew someone who would. That evening, I invited my niece over under the guise of needing Wi-Fi help. She saw through me instantly. Once I showed her the profile, the messages, the fake orphanage story, she didn't ask why. I saw it in her eyes. The quiet rage, the protective instinct. She said, "Let's track him." We started by downloading the full metadata from every email. She ran each header through IP lookup tools. Most bounced through servers in Europe, but one stood out, an unmasked node pinging from Lagos, Nigeria. "That's your first breadcrumb," she told me, "and if he slipped once, he'll slip again." She helped me set up dummy accounts, one with a fresh identity, another to pose as a different potential target. We wanted to see if he used the same patterns, same pictures, same stories. I named my new fake persona Laura, a retired violinist from Savannah. 2 days later, Stephen Hayes messaged Laura. Word for word, the same introduction, same picture, same poetry reference. That night, I cried, but not from sadness, from something sharper, something righteous. He wasn't just deceiving me, he was running an assembly line of deception. And I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was undercover.
It felt strange, setting bait for a man who thought he had already caught me. But there I was, sitting at my kitchen table, wearing my late husband's cardigan, typing messages as Laura, the fictional violinist I had become for this trap. The old me would have felt ridiculous, pretending, lying. But now I understood. Sometimes the only way to expose a liar is to become a mirror for their own deception. And sure enough, Stephen took the bait. He wrote to Laura with the same rhythm he had used on me. Good morning messages with poetic metaphors, conversations about loss and loneliness, carefully timed compliments. He even sent the same orphanage story, word for word. Except this time, I was ready. Every word he typed, every photo he shared, I captured. Screenshots, timestamps, metadata. My evidence folder grew like a wildfire. And the more I documented, the less emotional it became. I wasn't the widow he had targeted anymore. I was the one watching him now. When he brought up the customs fee again, this time asking Laura for $2,000 to unblock the shipment, my heart didn't ache. It beat with precision. Because I knew this was the first moment I could trace a transaction. With my niece's help, we set up a traceable account. Not a real bank, but a sandbox environment used for law enforcement simulations through one of her cybersecurity contacts at a local university. The idea was simple: get him to attempt the transfer and record everything that followed. We didn't need to send the money, we just needed him to reach for it. And he did. He sent wiring instructions to a third-party broker in Kuala Lumpur. The name was fake, but the routing number was real. That was our thread. And when he tried to pressure Laura, saying time was running out and the children would suffer, I saw the emotional tactics I had once fallen for, but now recognized as scripts. But the final confirmation came 3 days later. Another email, this time from a different account. Same man, different name, Robert J., different city, same face, same story, sent to a different woman. Someone I'd connected with in a victim forum I had joined quietly the week before. That's when I knew. This was bigger than one scammer. This was a network. And I wasn't just going to expose Stephen. I was going to pull the whole rotten thread.
They say predators count on silence, that they thrive when their victims are too ashamed to speak, too afraid to connect, too isolated to fight back. What Stephen, or whatever his name truly was, didn't anticipate was that silence could break. And when it does, it echoes. It started with a private forum, a quiet online space for women who had been through something like this: love that wasn't real, money that vanished, trust that had been weaponized. I joined under a pseudonym, posted cautiously, and shared just enough to draw attention. Within 48 hours, 6 women responded. All of them had spoken to Stephen, or Michael, or George. Same face, same orphanage, same story. They came from different corners of the country. A retired school teacher in Arizona, a single mom in Pennsylvania, a widowed painter in Oregon. Each had believed, each had paid, and each was living with the weight of shame they didn't deserve to carry. We called ourselves the Lost Letters. And together, we started comparing notes, timelines, screenshots, transaction receipts. We created spreadsheets, marked overlapping dates, tracked duplicate messages. It became clear this wasn't a man. It was a machine, a system, a scripted operation that recycled stories like junk mail. But we weren't junk. We were women who had learned how to read between the lines. One of them, Martha, the teacher, had lost nearly $40,000. She had mortgaged her car thinking she was saving lives. She cried as she told us, not out of sorrow, but fury. Another, Joanne, had reported her scammer to local police, but was laughed out of the precinct. Online romance isn't a crime, they told her. That was about to change. Because what these men didn't know was that I wasn't just documenting anymore. I was organizing. We pooled our findings. We created a joint drive. My niece built us a secure channel to upload voice memos, bank traces, phone screenshots. One woman had traced a phone number to a prepaid burner in New Jersey. Another had kept a notebook of exact phrases used over time. And one, quiet, meticulous Eleanor, had already filed a Freedom of Information Act request on an associated crypto wallet. We were no longer targets. We were analysts, strategists, a task force born from trauma. That night, we all gathered on Zoom, our real faces, for the first time. It was one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed. Women who'd once sat alone in quiet shame now looked each other in the eye and said, "No more." I looked at those faces, some older, some younger, all carrying the same invisible bruise. And I thought, he didn't plan for us. He expected weakness. He found a wall. And I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was part of an army. We gave ourselves 1 week, 7 days to gather, refine, prepare, and then hit them all at once. Not with insults, not with threats, but with precision. We knew these men worked in coordination. They used VPNs, bounced identities, automated replies. But they weren't perfect. They got greedy, sloppy, and worst of all, they underestimated the very people they targeted. The plan was simple but elegant. Each of us, the lost letters, would play our roles. Some would keep the conversation going as if nothing had changed. Others would subtly introduce pressure. We would ask for a phone call, a video, a proof of life. Meanwhile, my niece and a cybersecurity specialist she knew from college were setting up trackers inside image links and attachments. Every time he clicked, he'd reveal more than he realized. My role was to draw him into a live conversation, voice only. We knew he had refused video over and over again, but we wanted to record his voice. My niece had set up a line that routed through a digital capture system, one that would allow us to analyze accent markers, background noise, and cadence. Clues. It took 3 tries, but on the 4th night, he picked up. His voice was warm, polished, too polished. I introduced myself as Laura and told him I had just wired $2,000. Of course, the wire didn't exist, but he didn't know that. He thanked me, blessed me, said I had a heart like a golden bell. He had no idea I was recording every breath. That same night, Martha texted our group, "Got a crypto wallet address. He slipped." Joanne uploaded screenshots from her fake wire transfer receipt. Eleanor pulled IPs from the image links. We were harvesting data faster than he could switch identities. By Thursday, we had compiled a 36-page dossier. Names, aliases, transaction patterns, server footprints, at least 12 confirmed victims across 5 states. We didn't know yet how many others there were, but we knew we had enough. I printed out the file, held it in my hands, and then I did something I never thought I'd do. I called the FBI. The woman on the other end of the line listened patiently. I could hear the hesitation in her voice at first, until I said, "I'm not just calling to report fraud. I'm calling to hand you a complete active scam operation with names, dates, digital footprints, and a coordinated network of victims ready to testify." There was silence. And then, "We'll assign an agent to you immediately." That evening, our group video call felt different. We weren't just angry anymore. We were powerful. And Stephen Hayes, or whatever his name was running out of time. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. I was sitting by my window, the same one I'd stared out of every morning since Jim died, when the email arrived. Not from Stephen, not from Michael, from a new address entirely. The subject line was simple: "You think you're clever." My stomach turned. The email wasn't romantic. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't warm. It was a threat. He knew. He knew we were watching. He knew we had traced his accounts. He knew we had gone to law enforcement. But what he didn't know, what he could never know, was how ready we were. I didn't panic. I documented everything, took screenshots, reported the address. My niece forwarded it to our FBI contact. Within hours, they confirmed what we suspected. It had come from the same server cluster. He'd broken his pattern, and in doing so, he gave us the final thread. But emotionally,
that message hit like a slap. Not because I feared him, but because it reminded me who he truly was. Gone was the soft-spoken man quoting Neruda. Gone was the grieving widower who loved sunset photos and imaginary orphans. This was the real man. Cornered, exposed, dangerous, and scared. That night, I listened again to the recording of our phone call, not to analyze his accent or isolate background noise. No, this time I listened to the pauses, the way he said thank you too quickly, the way he never asked about me unless it served the story, the way his tone dropped when I questioned timelines. It wasn't affection, it was performance. And I had believed it. There was pain in that, not because I missed him, but because I had to admit how deeply I'd wanted to believe someone saw me. But I had learned something more important. I no longer needed to be seen. I needed to be heard. And that's exactly what was happening. The FBI agent, Agent Marcus Lang, called the next day. Calm voice, methodical. He said the task force had flagged the IPs as part of a larger operation. They were connecting the crypto wallets to laundering routes. The name Stephen Hayes had been used in at least 17 ongoing scams. Mine was the first with a complete file. "You've given us a foundation," he said. No one had ever said that to me before, that I'd built something solid out of something broken. That evening, I sat on my porch as the storm rolled in. The wind snapped through my garden like it was shaking loose palais. I let it. I welcomed it, because I knew the mask had finally fallen. And the man behind it, he wasn't special. He was just next. The courthouse smelled like old stone and stronger coffee. I hadn't been inside one since Jim and I filed for the deed to our first home. But this time, I wasn't there to begin a life. I was there to protect others from having theirs dismantled. Agent Lang met me in the lobby. He spoke with the steadiness of someone used to pain. He didn't coddle. He didn't dramatize. He simply said, "Your voice matters now more than ever." That morning, I was sworn in to give testimony, not in a formal trial, not yet, but in a preliminary hearing that would determine whether our case would become part of a broader federal indictment. I wasn't nervous, not because I'm brave, but because by then I'd learned that fear, like silence, only has power if you give it oxygen. I was done feeding it. I spoke clearly, calmly. I told them how he found me, how he weaved grief into flattery, how he never asked for money until he did. I told them how he didn't just take from wallets, he took from dignity. And when the assistant U.S. attorney asked if I thought he deserved jail time, I didn't flinch. I said, he didn't just lie. He made widows feel wanted so he could make them feel worthless. If that's not criminal, I don't know what is. You could hear the breath in the room tighten. After the hearing, a woman I didn't know, someone from another case I'd later learn, approached me. She didn't speak. She just took my hand and squeezed it, hard, the way people do when words fail and shared pain becomes language. Later that day, back at home, I logged into our forum. The Lost Letters group had doubled. More names, more stories, more women who thought they were alone until they saw themselves in my words. It struck me then that this was no longer just about justice for me. It was about building a net strong enough to catch the ones still falling. That night, Agent Lang called with the update. The DOJ was officially opening a multi-state case. And our file? It was marked as Exhibit A. I stood at the kitchen counter, the same place where I once opened Stephen's first message, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since. This wasn't just a scam case anymore. It was a reckoning.
For weeks, Stephen Hayes had been nothing more than pixels, a phantom, a story with no spine. But now, the stories had names, addresses, bank accounts, passports. Real people, real predators. Agent Lang called it a breakthrough. I called it finally. Their forensic tech team had followed the breadcrumbs we laid. IP pings, crypto wallets, recorded voice samples, even slips and speech patterns that hinted at language switching. The result was staggering. 5 men, 3 continents, 1 coordinated scam network. And every single one had used Stephen Hayes. He wasn't a man. He was a mask passed from hand to hand like a poisoned cup. One name in particular made my breath freeze. Samuel Onakoya, age 34, Nigerian national, former IT student, no criminal record, but a long trail of offshore accounts and flagged transactions. It was his voice I had recorded, his bank routing number we had traced, his fingers behind the keyboard when Stephen told me I made him believe in love again. I stared at his photo for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because part of me, some fragile sliver, had hoped Stephen might still be real. Not the love, no, but the man. Someone misguided. Someone broken, maybe. Not someone trained to weaponize affection. But Samuel had no such history, no tragic backstory. Just a resume of fraud and manipulation, cleverly cloaked under romantic scripts and algorithm-tweaked charm. And he wasn't working alone. The team uncovered Telegram groups, dark web marketplaces, training manuals, step-by-step guides on empathy extraction, as they called it, instructions on how to fake widowhood, how to sound sincere, how to time emotional drops for maximum payout. I felt sick, but I also felt vindicated. This wasn't a one-off. This was a business model. And I'd torn back the curtain. The FBI issued warrants. Interpol was looped in. Bank accounts were frozen. Samuel was placed on a travel ban list. The net was tightening. And our evidence, our messages, our recordings, our digital traps were the threads that wove it together. But there was more. One of the documents seized from a crypto exchange revealed a list of active marks, dozens of names, all women, mostly over 60, mostly widowed, every single one cataloged like prey. And there, at the top of the file, was me, Helen Mathers, Oregon, emotional, cautious, ideal for delayed trust model. It was like reading my own obituary. I didn't cry. I printed the list, folded it, put it in Jim's old file cabinet next to our will, and then I sat down, opened my laptop, and wrote a message to every woman on that list we could confirm. I told them what had happened, what almost happened, and that it wasn't their fault.
The courthouse looked different this time. Not because the walls had changed, but because I had. The last time I stood in this building, I was testifying to a room full of strangers, clutching evidence like a shield. Now, I walked in with purpose, with strategy, with something I hadn't had in years: power. The trial had begun, not just against Samuel Onikoya, but against 4 other men connected to the network we had exposed. The Department of Justice had consolidated our cases into a federal prosecution. Charges included wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals. And I was their star witness. When I took the stand, I didn't shake. I didn't weep. I told the truth. Slowly, clearly. I described how he found me, how he drew me in, how he built a false world, one compliment at a time. I showed them the messages, the fake orphanage appeal, the phone call he never thought was recorded. The jurors didn't look away. At one point, the defense attorney asked if I had ever truly loved Stephen. I smiled. I loved the idea of him, but he loved the idea of my money. Gasps echoed softly from the courtroom gallery. And from that moment on, I knew the tide had turned. But what moved me most was what came after I stepped down. One by one, other women took the stand. Martha, Joanne, Eleanor, names I had once only seen on screen, now standing in person, giving voice to their pain. None of us cried for ourselves anymore. We cried for the women who never got to stand in that room. The ones who lost everything, some who'd even lost their lives, too ashamed to tell anyone they'd been fooled. The prosecutor held nothing back. He showed the jury documents from the seized scammer training manual, phrases like target emotional widows and build fantasy first, then extract. We watched the jurors' jaws clench. One wiped her eyes. The defense tried to argue lack of intent, that Samuel and his associates were just misguided young men trying to survive. But we had proof. They weren't surviving, they were hunting. After closing arguments, we were dismissed for deliberation. As I left the courtroom that day, I didn't feel nervous. I felt complete. Whatever the verdict, we had pulled the curtain back, and now the world could see what we had seen far too late. This wasn't a dating problem. It was a criminal enterprise, and justice had entered the room.
The day the verdict was read, the sky broke open. Dark clouds hovered like waiting witnesses, and rain fell in sheets against the courthouse steps, as if the earth itself wanted to cleanse something. I sat in the front row, hands folded, heart steady. Not quiet, not loud, just steady. Around me sat the women I had come to know better than some family members. Martha in her navy jacket, Joanne with her notepad clasped like a prayer book, Eleanor in that same gray scarf she always wore during Zoom calls. The judge entered, the jury filed in, and time, for a moment, stopped breathing. I watched their faces. No one looked away from us, not even the men on trial, especially not Samuel. The foreman stood. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit like thunder. Every count, guilty. Identity theft, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Targeting vulnerable individuals, guilty. With each pronouncement, A weight lifted from somewhere I didn't even know had been buried beneath me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, stronger. It was justice. Samuel's face didn't change. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, just stared ahead, already calculating his next move, maybe even fantasizing about appeals. But it didn't matter. Because that day, we reclaimed something he could never steal. Our right to be heard, to be believed, to matter. After court adjourned, the prosecutor hugged each of us. I remember him telling me, "You cracked the whole thing open." But all I could think about was the others, the names we couldn't find, the women who never reported, the families who still thought their mother or aunt just made a bad decision. No, they didn't. They were hunted, and not everyone survives being hunted. Outside, as we stepped into the rain, the storm met us like applause from the sky. I tilted my head upward and let it hit my face. Cold, cleansing, real. For the first time in years, I felt clean. Martha leaned in and whispered, "What now?" I smiled. "Now we make sure this never happens again." And in that storm, under that heavy sky, we agreed our fight wasn't over. It had just changed forms.
Some legacies are written in money, others in blood. Ours was written in betrayal and rebuilt with truth. Weeks after the verdict, life began to return to its soft routines. Tea in the morning, crossword puzzles, walks past the park bench Jim used to love. But under the surface, everything had changed. People recognized me now, at the market, at church, even online, where a clip of my courtroom testimony had gone viral, shared with the caption, "She didn't just survive the scam, she shut it down." I received messages from strangers, widows, nurses, daughters of victims, all saying the same thing. "You said what we couldn't." It was humbling and heavy. I hadn't asked for this legacy. None of us had. But now it was ours, and I was determined to use it. With the help of my niece, we launched a platform, the Lost Letters Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to educating older adults about digital fraud, helping victims seek legal justice, and training law enforcement to take these crimes seriously. We secured funding within a month. Donations poured in. Victims who had once been shamed into silence now stepped forward, offering time, stories, even their savings to protect others. Martha became our education director. Joanne ran survivor outreach. Eleanor, our data archivist, built the first public database of reported romance scam phrases and tactics. We became a lighthouse, and predators hate the light. But it wasn't easy. We received threats, anonymous messages warning us to back off, false social media reports. One of our webinars was hacked. I won't lie, some nights I sat by my window gripping Jim's old mug tighter than I needed to, wondering if we were in over our heads. But then, a letter arrived from a woman in Utah, 79 years old, widowed. She'd received a message from a man using Stephen's exact lines. This time, she Googled the phrases, found our site, reported him. No money lost, no shame taken. The letter ended with this: "Because of you, I recognize the danger. And for the first time since my husband died, I felt strong again. I cried. Not because I was sad, but because the storm had passed through me, and now I was building shelter for someone else. We had turned our scars into blueprints, and what began as a private humiliation had become a public shield. This was our legacy now, the one we didn't ask for, but the one we would fight to protect."
There's a strange silence that comes after a long war. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of stillness. The kind that follows after you've screamed everything that needed to be said, and finally, there's nothing left to fear. That's what I felt the morning I opened the letter from the Department of Justice. It was a formal acknowledgement, a statement of gratitude, a certificate signed and sealed commending my testimony and contributions to the prosecution that led to 5 federal convictions. They even mentioned our foundation. But it wasn't the paper that made me cry. It was the line at the bottom. "You turned vulnerability into power. You are the reason this case became possible. For so long, I had defined myself by what was taken. Jim's passing, my trust, my peace. But now, for the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had found a place to belong. Outside me, behind me, processed." And that day, I did something I hadn't done since all this began. I changed my email signature. For months, I'd been Helen M., widow, retired teacher. But I erased that. Now it simply read Helen Mathers, founder, advocate, survivor. I took a walk down to the cafe where I used to meet Jim on Sundays. I sat at our old table, sipped my coffee slowly, and watched the world pass by. It looked the same, but I didn't. A woman sat down across from me, not a stranger, but someone I'd seen in our foundation's webinar a few weeks ago. She looked nervous, like she didn't want to intrude. So I smiled. And she said, "You don't know me, but I know you. You saved me." I reached for her hand. "No," I said, "we saved each other." We sat in silence for a long while, not needing to say more. Later that evening, I stood in front of my mirror adjusting the small brooch Jim had given me for our 25th anniversary. For the first time in years, I looked at my reflection and didn't see loss. I saw fire. Because I'd walked through betrayal, through shame, through fear, and I had come out holding not just my name, but my voice. And no one would ever take that from me again.
Thank you for watching. If this touched you, subscribe for more true life tales of resilience and justice. And if you've ever been through something similar, share your voice in the comments below. Because every voice matters, especially yours.